A solid understanding of pretrial assessments begins with an awareness about what pretrial assessments measure. Put simply, they measure a pretrial risk. But what does that mean? To understand pretrial assessments, we have to examine the type of risk they measure and how they articulate the amount of risk. So we start with two questions: risk of what and how much risk? Let's look at the first question, risk of what? What type of risks do pretrial assessments measure? Most pretrial assessments measure two outcomes: the likelihood that people will fail to appear in court pretrial, and the likelihood that people will be arrested again during the pretrial period. It's also important to recognize what pretrial assessments do not measure. They do not measure the risk of flight. Flight and failure to appear are very different behaviors. We know from research and decades of experience that failure to appear is far more common than is flight from a jurisdiction to avoid prosecution. When people do not show up for court pretrial, it's almost always because they forget about the hearing, had trouble with transportation, were confused about when and where to appear, or they couldn't get off work or find childcare. It's almost never because they fled the jurisdiction. Pretrial assessments also do not measure the likelihood of being arrested for specific crimes. We know from research and experience that people are arrested for a nonviolent or low-level offense far more frequently than they are for a new violent or other serious offense. People are arrested for nonviolent offenses such as property, drug, driving, or public order far more often than they are for a violent offense, such as assault or robbery. Let's move to the second question, how much risk? Again, it's helpful to think about what an assessment tool doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us who's risky and who is not risky. Risk is not an either-or proposition. Rather, it's more useful to view risk as existing on a continuum or a scale, like the one shown here. People's risk could range from a very small amount, such as 1%, all the way up to a very large amount, such as 99%, with everything in between. Because there are no absolutes, the continuum of risk starts at 1% rather than 0 and ends at 99% rather than 100. There's no such thing as no risk. All people, regardless of their current charges, criminal history, or life circumstances, including you and me, would be at some degree of risk for not appearing in court. Our car could break down, or we could have a serious family emergency. These things would probably cause us to miss court that day. On the opposite side, we've learned there's no guarantee of failure. Even for people with serious charges and long criminal histories, many of them still succeed on pretrial release by appearing in court and remaining arrest-free. Understanding what type of risk that assessments measure and how they articulate that amount of risk is important because assessment results can help you make different pretrial decisions. The three key questions that should guide your examination of your pretrial system are: whom do we release and whom do we detain? How do we release people? And how do we detain people? To answer these questions, we have to know what the risk is for. Is the risk for failure to appear in court or for flight? Is the risk for being arrested for any new offense, even minor ones? Or is the risk for a serious or violent offense? And after we know what the risk is for, we need to know how much risk is present. Is it a little bit or a lot, or somewhere in between? Once you understand what an assessment measures and how it articulates the amount of risk, you're better able to consider the most appropriate and effective role an assessment can play in your pretrial decision-making.